This is LBC.
Good morning to you. 3 minutes after 9 on Monday, October the 15th. Now, roughly every other Monday, I get up in the morning with joy in my heart and a spring in my step because I know I'm going to be meeting Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's coming in to take your calls. But it was an even mightier spring in my step and a heart almost bursting with joy as I studied this morning headlines, because I thought, apart from perhaps Theresa May or Michel Barnier or Jean-Claude Juncker, if he's off the brandy, who better could I have in to talk about exactly what's going on than Jacob Rees-Mogg? So before I introduce him to you, let me just run through some of the headlines. I must start with the Times, of course. Brexit talks break up amid impasse over Irish border. The Guardian, setback for May as Irish border issue derails Brexit deal talks. The Telegraph, there's the word again, May puts brakes on customs union deal. The Express, half of Cabinet in threat to quit over Brexit. Jacob Rees-Mogg, you chair the all-important ERG. What the heck is going on? Good to see you as ever.
Well, thank you. It's always good to see you. And as I said when I arrived, it was a delight to see a very large poster of you on the side of the A4 as people come into central London. I think there should be more of these.
Well, we'll split the next one. You and I will get... Actually, perhaps not, Jacob. We'll see how that goes. I might do a station a great disservice there.
It's absolutely the crunch point for the negotiations, and there are three remaining issues. Ireland is one of them, the money is the other, and the customs union is the third. Now, what seems to have been happening is that the government was essentially giving in on the issue of the customs union and of the money. So not having strings attached to the money, paying £40 billion without knowing what we get. On the customs union, it looked as if the government was heading towards a situation where we could have been perpetually in a customs union without any say over how it was run. But the third issue, the government seems to have shown some backbone, and that's over the border between the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom, and that the EU wanted a backstop that would have turned Northern Ireland into a colony of the European Union. And thanks in part to being reliant on her majority, Mrs May, reliant on her majority on the DUP, the Prime Minister has said no to that, and that seems to be where we are, and we'll see what happens over the next 48 hours.
How key is the next 48 hours?
I think the next 48 hours is very important. It's important both in terms of the type of deal under which we leave. That if after 48 hours the Chequers / near Norway style approach is not working, that is to say, pretty close integration, maintaining EU rules and things like that, it is stymied by the Irish question, then there will either be an opportunity for the government to say we must then move to a Canada-style deal, or we'll be heading towards no deal, no withdrawal agreement and leaving on World Trade Organization terms. There's also an issue in terms of parliamentary numbers, that it's become increasingly clear that the government would not get a majority in Parliament for a deal that spent £40 billion for nothing or left us perpetually in a customs union. So it needs the government to move, and it may be that the EU's intransigence is actually helping the government to reposition itself.
Lastly, before we go to the calls, this leaders' summit in a couple of days, it's pointless now, isn't it?
Not necessarily. The question has always been who runs the European Union, and the Commission, because it's there on a daily basis, has the lion's share of influence on routine matters and has used that very effectively to centralise power. But ultimately, the nation-states are the power behind the European Union, and if the heads of government were to say, actually, we need to get to a sensible agreement and that the Commission has pushed things too far, they would be able to overrule the Commission. But there's no sign of that at the moment, and a number of the key leaders, particularly Angela Merkel, are distracted by other things, and she's just had a terrible election result in Bavaria.
I will actually go to that. I was going to ask you about Bavaria. Where does that leave Germany, actually? Never mind Angela Merkel.
Well, it certainly leaves Mrs Merkel's position considerably weakened. Her political authority is in a state of decline, and when politicians find their political authority is declining, it becomes incrementally harder to do things and to achieve things. It also means that the Chancellor of Germany is bound to be focused on German issues rather than on European issues. What it does for Germany more broadly is a reminder of how difficult it is to force things upon nations in an undemocratic way, that they end up moving to extremes if that's what you try to do.
Is there a chance, and perhaps that some of the European leaders will think, hang on a moment, we're possibly spending too much time on this Brexit. We've got issues in Austria, we've got issues in Hungary, we've got, just see what's happened to Angela in Germany, we know what's happening in Italy, we've got Spain. Right, let's get a Brexit deal done and start addressing problems in our own backyard. Surely that moment must be round the corner.
You would have thought. And that would push, you would expect, towards a Canada-style deal, because...
Just get it done. Just get it done and move on.
That's basically off the shelf. That's there to be done. It's fairly straightforward. But you're quite right. And President Macron's poll ratings are even lower than former President Hollande's. I mean, that's not a great position to be in.
Yeah, I'd forgotten him. Right, let's get to the calls. Hopefully I'll grab another minute with you along the way. Brian is in Stockton-on-Tees, and you're through to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Good morning to you, Brian.
Yeah, good morning. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, sir. What's your point? Your question, rather?
My question was to Jacob. How long can you keep still backing Theresa May as Prime Minister if she keeps saying the only deal on the table is Chequers?
Oh, well, thank you, Brian. I mean, it's a very pertinent question, and I've consistently said that it's about changing the policy, not the individual. I think we have to wait and see what...
No, she won't change the policy, as Brian says, Mr. Rees-Mogg.
But the policy may have to be changed regardless. That's why it's right to be patient. You see, the policy hasn't worked, that the policy isn't acceptable to the European Union. It's not going to get through the House of Commons. So I think the pressure to move the policy on is very considerable, and that the policy of Chequers will not be the basis on which we leave the European Union. And as in other areas, I have considerable confidence in the Prime Minister. I'm very happy to carry on supporting her.
But if Brian, your point is, at what point, presumably, as you said, will Mr. Rees-Mogg say we have to...
How much longer do you give her,
Yeah, you won't. She hasn't changed the policy, i.e. we must change the person. Mr. Rees-Mogg.
She said, Nick, it's the only thing she has on the table, apart from no deal.
But to be fair to somebody in a negotiation, you have to say that what you're offering is the only thing on the table. You can't say, oh, and by the way, I've got lots of other things up my sleeve just in case. So I think...
Jacob, it's going for no deal, isn't it? You just said it won't pass the government, do you? Very unlikely. That is no deal.
I think the government's approach to Chequers has increased the likelihood of having no withdrawal agreement. I think that's absolutely right. But no deal is nothing to be frightened of. So if the alternative is Chequers or leaving without a withdrawal agreement...
The thing is now, Jacob, she has to sort it out now with the Cabinet, get the Cabinet back in line to continue, right, to stop more people leaving out the Cabinet.
Yes, that must be right. The Prime Minister would be very weakened if any Cabinet Minister resigned. That's clearly true.
Jacob? Do you agree with this?
Last point, Brian.
She's on a third wand, isn't she? She can't go doing this again. You know... Anything, when she goes to the EU now, she has to get it passed by a Cabinet and the DUP. Otherwise, she is toast, isn't she?
Well, I wouldn't say she's toast, even at breakfast time. I think the issue is, where you're right, is that the Prime Minister cannot afford to lose another Cabinet Minister. She has to maintain a collective responsibility. And that's true of all Prime Ministers. They need to maintain the support of their cabinets. And you're also right that the majority Mrs May has is dependent upon the DUP. And that's why I think there's a good chance that this policy will, to use the Prime Minister's own word, evolve into something that the country can accept and is genuinely leaving the European Union, rather than the Chequers deal, which is basically staying in the European Union but without having a vote.
Brian, thank you. You may have caught sight of a piece in one of the papers yesterday, Mr. Rees-Mogg, the Sunday Times, in which David Davis, the former Brexit negotiator, suggested that members of the Cabinet could resign if a summit does not produce a result to their liking. It's thought he probably meant Esther McVey, Penny Mordaunt and Andrea Leadsom. Do you agree?
I believe in the principle of Cabinet government. That is to say, it is not the Prime Minister who decides everything. It is what the Cabinet agrees that is the collective policy of the government. And it's crucial that if members of the Cabinet don't agree with that, they resign. That's always been the case. Cabinet ministers have to be able to stand up and say, I support government policy. If they don't, they need to leave the government, and that is the historic constitutional position, and that policy is as determined by the Cabinet, not the individual will of the Prime Minister.
But you've just said she'd be fatally holed below the water if another Cabinet member was left.
The Prime Minister cannot afford to lose another Cabinet Minister. I think that is true.
But you agree with David Davis saying if they don't like any deal, they should walk?
But that's obviously true. That's the basic constitutional position. But therefore, I think the Prime Minister would be wise to get a deal that her Cabinet can support.
Chris is in Billinghurst. Go ahead, Chris. Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Morning, Jacob.
Morning, sir.
Morning, Chris.
Well, my question, I'm interested that, given that Theresa May's ruled out a Canada-style deal, and that's because she doesn't believe it solves the Northern Ireland border issue, what proposal can you see that's achievable that would satisfy not only the EU but the whole of the Conservative Party and the wider electorate?
Chris,
It's not possible, is it?
It's a very important question. Why is the Canada deal not popular with the Prime Minister? And I think the reason is twofold. The first, as you rightly say, is the Irish question. The European Research Group, which I chair, has put forward proposals to meet the concerns of the European Union on the integrity of the single market and to show how the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland can be at least as good as the EU's other borders with third countries, of which I think there are about 30, to make sure that what goes on there doesn't affect the integrity of the single market, including allowing officials representing the EU, employed technically by member states, to inspect things in the United Kingdom to make sure that companies exporting to the EU met the EU's rules. And that was in an article by Ian Duncan Smith. And the effort there was to try and provide an answer from the EU's point of view. And I think it's a pretty good answer, and certainly the basis for a negotiation to deal with the Irish question. The second point is that the Prime Minister promised frictionless trade on leaving the European Union. And I think that's unrealistic, that we've got to recognise we are leaving the European Union, and therefore the situation will be different. And there is anyway some friction in trade already in relation to VAT returns and different excise duties on particular goods. And the question is to minimise friction, not to have no friction at all, because that was never a realistic proposition.
Chris, a response from you?
Well, I don't disagree, and I think that's a practical way forward. But the reality is that the deal's off the table. Canada-style deal is not being discussed. It's not acceptable. So my question again is, what's the alternative? What would satisfy the ERG, me as a Leave voter, and the Conservative Party?
Canada is on the deal from the EU's point of view. I mean, they've offered the best trade deal they've ever done with any third country, with no tariffs and no quotas. And I think we should welcome that and build on that. So it's only off the table from the Prime Minister's point of view. And I think she'd be well advised to put it on the table, which would be acceptable, as you put it, both to Leave voters and to the ERG. The alternative is we leave without a withdrawal agreement. We have £40 billion extra of taxpayers' money in our pocket. We have some difficulty next March. I think it'd be foolish of me to say that there would be no transition issues. There definitely would be. Whether they're queues at Dover or whatever, there would be some difficulties. But these would be overcome as we would begin to trade with the EU on a perfectly normal world trade basis, and would be an interim stage to a much cleaner and quicker Brexit. It's not an advantage-free proposition.
Chris, thank you. Talking about queues at Dover, when you heard, as I'm sure you did last week, that there's suggestions that the M26 could be turned into some sort of giant lorry park, did you A, think, yes, Europe will hear that and they'll realise that we mean business, or B, oh dear God, we're going to have a lorry park in the middle of Kent? Or did you think a bit of both?
Well, I think you've got to make preparations for the worst case. That's what wise governments do, and the government should have done it earlier, to be straightforward about it, that you don't expect the worst case to happen, but you need to be ready in case it does. So I think it's intelligent planning. I imagine many of your listeners were very upset to hear that there was a risk to the price of caviar in one of the notes that came out from the government, which seems to be an issue troubling our bureaucrats, that they are fearful that their supplies will be a little bit more expensive.
That one passed me by, but it leads me neatly into the subject of food. Are you part of the two-day, and it's reported in the Times, so it will be true, the two-day charm offensive that will begin with a series of lunches and dinners for Brexit-backing MPs?
I was very kindly invited, but on a day that I couldn't go, I had another engagement.
So you won't be attending this attempt to woo you?
Look, I've held my views on Brexit for quite a long time. A fine dinner, however great the wine, even if it were the bottle that's just sold for over £500,000, would not change my view on Brexit.
It's what you have to swallow after the meal, is it? That's the problem.
That's how Andrew Bridgens put it, and I think that's a very good line.
It's a nice line, isn't it? Right, let's go to other matters, because you have the ability to put all sorts of questions to Rees-Mogg. He's across world affairs as well. And David in Paddington, you're taking us elsewhere in the world, I think. David, good morning. You're on the radio.
Good morning, Jacob. As a man who goes to church and is religious, how can you morally justify us profiting by selling arms to Saudi Arabia whilst 18 million people are about to be on the starvation line, the worst humanitarian crisis in this century?
In the Yemen, I think you refer, don't you? Yes.
Yes.
Yemen, of course, yes.
OK. Stay on the line, David. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
David, thank you for the question. Our relationship with Saudi Arabia is one of the hardest issues to deal with in terms of foreign policy, both morally and practically. The issue we face is, what would it be better or worse if we did not maintain a relationship with Saudi Arabia? And if you look at some of our interventions in the Middle East over the past couple of decades, very often what we do for a moral purpose turns out to have an immoral effect. And therefore I think one should be very cautious about moralising about foreign affairs. But I don't deny the point you're making. I think the behaviour of both Iran and Saudi Arabia in Yemen is so unbelievably unsavoury, inhumane, as to be a blot on humanity. The question is, how do you best deal with that? How do you stop it without creating further problems in the Middle East? And I think our removing ourselves from our close relationship with Saudi Arabia would probably make things worse rather than better.
David, a response from... David?
Yes. They are, every single day, they're committing war crimes. They're bombing hospitals, schools. We are profiting from it. We are culpable. Our Foreign Secretary should be in the United Nations banging his fist on the table and demanding a ceasefire, sending a UN force in there. This is 18 million people. You are morally culpable, Jacob.
I wish that the Foreign Secretary banging his fist on the table would have any effect at the United Nations. It wouldn't. And that there's no good arguing for a Council of Perfection in an unreal world. We have to deal with the world as it is. And in some occasions, that is not a nice place. And I think you're calling for something that you're right to call for, but you're unrealistic in the way you're calling for it.
David, thank you. Broadening this out, there is Saudi Arabia today defying threats by the West to retaliate over the disappearance of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the consulate in Turkey. What reaction, moving away from the hideous, as you rightly describe it, Yemeni conflict, what reaction should the West be taking as regards what could have happened to that journalist?
Well, we should take it as seriously as the attempted murder and then murder of people in Salisbury. That
why? It's in Turkey, though, isn't it?
But as a general principle of international order, foreign countries cannot cross borders and murder people that they do not like. That is simply a means of leading to the breakdown of any form of world order. Who in the world does the UK want to bump off? Who does the US want to bump off? Where does it stop if you allow this to happen? And Saudi Arabia is an ally of ours. We would have no justification in supporting an ally if it turns out that Saudi Arabia is guilty. And therefore, what do we need? We need the type of investigation carried out in relation to Russia and Salisbury to establish the facts, to be clear who is responsible. And if it is satisfactorily shown that Saudi Arabia is responsible, then Saudi Arabia must suffer consequences from this.
Such as?
Well, we must look at what we've done with Russia. You must think of applying sanctions. You must think of targeting...
Well, if they put the oil price up, you're a keen economist, that would hurt just about everything, wouldn't it, Mr.
Well, that's the difficulty in dealing with Saudi Arabia. But there comes a point at which you have to say, look, this is simply not behaviour that is allowed in an effort to maintain an international good order. And if... and you know, we need to be certain, we need to have the evidence. If Saudi Arabia were responsible for the murder of a journalist in a foreign country against its own law as well as international law and Turkish law, then consequences must follow.
All right. Staying with world affairs before we come back to domestic matters, some commentators have said that the American judicial system has been fatally damaged by the extraordinary saga in getting Judge Brett Kavanaugh actually onto the Supreme Court. Trump, was finally successful. At what cost?
Well, I think it's a basic issue of the American Constitution, and it's one of the weaknesses of the US Constitution compared to the UK Constitution. That is to say, the ultimate arbiters of everything are the judges, and therefore the judges have become very political. The US Constitution is incredibly difficult to change, and therefore, because it was established in the 19th century that the US Supreme Court can overturn congressional acts, there is huge power with them as a final body and it's been politicised by presidents over decades and decades.
Never quite to this degree, is that fair?
Oh, no, that's not so.
No?
No, if you think of what FDR was trying to do...
Okay, in recent memory, then?
No, all presidents appoint people who have their political bias, and really interestingly, when George W. Bush became president, the Supreme Court of Florida voted that it should have gone to Al Gore on an entirely Democrat-Republican ticket. They all voted according to the party who had appointed them. When it got to the Supreme Court, they voted that it should be George W. Bush on exactly the same basis. The Republicans voted for George W. Bush, the Democrats for Al Gore. And so that is their answer to the flaw in our Constitution, which is that an Act of Parliament can change anything at any point, however fundamental. And they have a Constitution that's very hard to change, and therefore an overmighty judiciary. We have a Constitution that's very easy to change, but therefore a government can do fundamental things in a 5-year period without any safeguards. And that's the balance that the two countries have each chosen.
Lastly on that, accused, and one must believe unfairly, of being a sexual deviant, a gang rapist, all sorts of others, unable to coach his daughter's basketball team as a result. Did you have sympathy with Judge Kavanaugh?
I think if the allegations were true, they deserved to be aired. That you never know in these cases who is telling the truth. And you, when appointing a judge for life, it's reasonable to have the information come out in the public and properly investigated. And actually, having watched some of the testimony of both sides, I was unable to feel any clear view as to who was telling the truth.
Probably only two people know. Staying with judges, we come home, though. John in Ilford, you have a question for Jacob Rees-Mogg. Go ahead, John. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for taking my call.
Yeah.
I just want to know, do you think it's fair that after lifting the 8-year pay freeze and giving the police a 1% pay rise this year, which works out about £32 a month, after the independent panel recommended 3%, it's then fair that the judges are being given a 32% pay rise, which works out about £60,000 a year?
You've got all the figures absolutely spot on. It takes them to around £240,000 per annum. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, John, I'm tempted to ask, what do you think? Are you a policeman by any chance?
I am.
You are. And I think what you think, and that is that the police, the front line of our justice system, play such an important role in keeping our society safe and, willing to put their lives on the line. As an MP, I'm very conscious of, with the coroner's inquest in relation to the murder of Keith Palmer having gone on recently, that it does seem out of kilter when the police are not getting 3%, that the judges are potentially getting a £60,000 pay rise.
Yes. So, John, a response from you. Let you go first.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, one thing I just wanted to get out there is, as you're probably aware, obviously, the pension changes that have happened over the last few years, that this could be seen that 3 weeks before the judges are due to go to court to have their tribunal case heard. This could be seen as some kind of hush payment or go quietly payment. It just doesn't seem fair or right to me.
No, it's worth remembering that in the 1930s, when pay restraint was introduced and every public servant had their pay cut, an exemption was made for the judges because they argued that it would undermine the independence of the judiciary if they didn't carry on being paid. The judges have always been pretty good at arguing their own corner for their own terms and conditions. On the other hand, you have to persuade very high-earning barristers that they want to become judges, and if we want to have the best judges that we can have, then we're going to have to pay for them. So it's not entirely an easy answer. It just at the moment seems out of kilter what's happening to other people.
John, thank you. Staying with legal matters, it is reported today that Anjem Chowdhury, the convicted hate preacher, will be out at some point this week, and the figure to guard him, to monitor him, to everything else that is required, £2 million a year. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, you can only put people in prison if they have broken the law, and a law that existed at the time at which they broke it, and they can then only be sentenced in accordance with the provisions of the law, and if their sentence ends, then justice must be carried out. We cannot have arbitrary justice. We've just spoken about Saudi Arabia potentially murdering a journalist in Turkey. If nations have arbitrary justice, then their whole foundation of the rule of law is undermined. And it's very easy to find an individual who's particularly unsavoury.
But do we go back up the conveyor belt? Should the terms have been tougher at the time of conviction?
Well, there was an opportunity for the Attorney-General to appeal against the sentence if he didn't think it was tough enough. Should Parliament toughen up the rules in future so that people who are convicted in the way he was convicted serve longer sentences? Yes, there's a very strong case for that. But you can't apply the law to people retrospectively. So, am I saying that we made a mistake and bungled it over, and this is not a party political point, just as a nation, we didn't have the laws in place to deal with people like him? And should we make sure that we now do? Yes. But can we invent retrospective law and maintain the rule of law? No, we can't.
All right. Let's come back to other matters. Indeed, we need to return to Brexit because there are so many other aspects. I mentioned that David Davis had an article in one of the papers yesterday. Boris Johnson has his column in The Telegraph today. It's still not too late to abandon this disastrous surrender of our country. And he questioned why, and said indeed he said it was totally wrong, that the government to agree to the Northern Irish backstop on December 8 last year. Your views on those 2 points?
Yes, I'm in favour of abandoning what is currently proposed, which seems pretty bad. And it's as if the government has been saved by the Irish question, actually, that the EU has so overplayed its hand on that the surrender on everything else seems to be being withdrawn, and let's hope that that continues. And the backstop agreed last year, well, one of the opening paragraphs of the agreement says nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And it's important to remember that nothing is firmly agreed yet. And we have to be very mindful of that before we start feeling that we are bound into things. Also, nothing constitutionally is agreed until it's passed through Parliament, that we have a system where our laws require the consent of the people of our Parliament. They're not made by an autocrat in Downing Street or anywhere else.
Final question on Brexit, final question for today. Anthony in Staines. Anthony, go ahead.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. I'd
Morning.
like to ask Mr. Rees-Mogg, good morning, about the Scottish question, whether he believes that we must take into account the people of Scotland, who of course did vote against Brexit, and indeed 2 of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom did vote against Brexit.
Well,
Does he agree with me that we need to bring those people on board to get this through?
Thank you, Anthony. I thought you were going to say the Scottish play when you started with the Scottish question, but it might be a bit early in the morning to discuss that. Of course, you make a very good point that many people in this country, 48%, voted against leaving the European Union. And it's important to remember that although the majority gets its way, it is important to respect the views of the minority. In terms of the Scottish issue, Scotland voted to remain in the United Kingdom not very long before the referendum to leave the European Union. So Scotland had committed to being part of a larger country that then voted to leave. So there's no democratic impropriety in Scotland leaving. And what I think it's important to do is to show the benefits of leaving to the people of Scotland, and some of that may come through, for example, fishing, where most of the fishing waters of the UK are Scottish waters. Getting those quotas back for the United Kingdom could be very helpful to coastal communities in Scotland and begins to be a symbol of how things can improve once we've left. And I was shocked to discover at a rally for Leave Means Leave on Saturday that 92% of the cod fishing quota does not go to the United Kingdom. We only get 8% of it. And there are fish.
There are indeed fish. Anthony, thank you. Before I let you go, a totally different matter. It was reported last week that Jeremy Corbyn is keen to bring more into the history lessons of our children. There should be more done about the legacy of the British Empire, the slave trade, how Britain interrupted a rich African and black history and exploited countries. Was colonialism a wholly bad thing?
No, colonialism was not a wholly bad thing, though. The British Empire had good and bad bits, like all sorts of things. Some of its bad bits were terrible, but some of its good bits were really wonderful. The ending of the slave trade was a remarkable success. Think of the death of Gordon at Khartoum. One of the reasons Gordon was at Khartoum was he was trying to stop the slave trade that was going on in the Sudan at that point. That there were noble figures, there were honourable figures, and there were rogues. But think of a Sleeman who puts down Thuggee in India so that people could travel in India without being murdered by an extraordinary robber cult. That we did great things in the British Empire, but there are blots on it as well. And that's true of all countries at all times, not just those that have empires, but also of what goes on at home, that there are things that have happened in the UK over the last 100 years, which, looking back on it, people are deeply ashamed.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry you won't get to your dinner with the Prime Minister, but I hope whatever the engagement is,
It's not with the Prime Minister. It's
with the team.
Yes.
Yeah, but I hope whatever the event is...
Had it been with the Prime Minister, I would have cancelled anything else.
Of course, but you have
rude to say
previous
no to the Prime
engagement.
Minister.
So you'll say no to the pizza or whatever it was going to be. Who knows? Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you
so much.
Conservative MP for North East Somerset, appearing here on LBC.